in heaven, but not of heaven. I had a very curious vision of heaven the other day, and I have been much perplexed as to whether I should tell it to my friends or not. The chief difficulty I find in giving it publicity arises from its apparent uncharitableness. It would seem at first sight as though I made the gate to the celestial city narrower than the Bible does, and therefore shut out a large number of those fully expecting to be welcomed there, and that with a flourish of trumpets. In this narrowing of the way it will be considered, perhaps, that my vision is at fault, and therefore somewhat misleading, but on its behalf I may suggest that as heaven is, as the Negro said, a mighty big place, it may be only some special part of the vast continent of blessedness. That caught my attention, and which is contemplated in my vision. Then, again, I have felt a difficulty in supposing myself to be any other than a good salvationist, and I have not failed to see that this also may lay my story open to objection. But, as everyone knows that dreams and visions are fantastic and contradictory things, I have thought that these eccentricities might be passed over for the useful lessons they are calculated to convey. I have, therefore, decided to let this one see the light, leaving the reader to judge whether it has any interest for, or any application to, himself. In my vision, I thought that, in some way or other, I had ceased to be, what I hope I am, in fact, a persistent seeker of souls and a resolute opponent of Satan. I thought that I had been transformed into a Christian of that type, which we all know is so very common around us. It may seem strange also, but I was not conscious whether I was connected with the Salvation Army or with any other religious organization. All I knew was the simple fact that I claimed to be a follower of Christ and regarded myself as having the favor of God, hoping for the enjoyment of the blessings promised to his people hereafter. In my vision I imagined that, so far as this world was concerned, Solomon's prayer was answered in my circumstances, for I had neither poverty nor riches. All my temporal wants were fully supplied. I had home, friends, and leisure, and all that was really necessary to happiness in those respects. I was, as I have already said, a Christian. Most of my more intimate friends professed to be the same. We visited at each other's houses, and were alike interested in each other's amusements, business engagements, political opinions, and many other things. We bought and sold, and married and gave in marriage. In short, we acted as though the world we were in was going to last forever. I thought also that I took some active part in the church to which I belonged. I always attended its services on the Sunday, held a prominent position in its financial management, and occupied myself zealously in teaching Bible truths to the children. Indeed, I considered myself quite a shining light. Now and then, not very often, I visited the sick in a friendly way, especially when they happened to be connected with my own circle of acquaintances, and in addition to these good deeds, I contributed a little money to support missionary operations. In all this, I was quite sincere. I had no notion of playing the hypocrite. In fact, I did not do so. It is true I did not stop to think what Christianity really was, although I talked about it freely enough at times and pitied people who did not profess it. But I seldom seriously considered what were the claims of Jesus Christ and the poor, sinning, suffering world about me, although I occasionally heard them discussed, but more seldom did I meditate upon the length and breadth of those claims in their relation to myself. I had gotten to a certain rut of thought, action, and profession, and I went on from day to day, hoping that all would turn out well at the last. But in my vision I fancied that, without any apparent warning, a dangerous fever seized me. I went down most unexpectedly, and before I knew where I was, the doctor pronounced me to be in a dangerous condition. In fact, in a few hours I was brought to the very verge of death. This was a serious business indeed. Everyone around me was in the greatest confusion, while many of those who loved me were paralyzed with despair. Then followed consultations with other physicians, a hurrying from far and near of my family, many suggestions as to remedies from my numerous friends and acquaintances, together with the most careful nursing which money could procure or affection dictate. But all proved in vain. For my own part, I did not feel any particular alarm about my state. Whether it was the suddenness of the visitation, or the benumbing character of the disease, or the effects of the narcotics which the doctors gave me to procure sleep or soothe the pain, I cannot tell. But strangely enough, I seemed to be the least disturbed person in the household. I felt as though I were in a dream. I knew I was ill, dangerously ill. For a relative insisted on my being informed of my real condition, and yet I was not distressed by the announcement. I thought I should recover. Most people do, I suppose, until the hand of death is actually on them. And if not, what need had I to worry myself? For was I not a Christian? Had not Christ died for me? Had I not been converted? Did I not believe in the Bible? Had I not lived a moral life? What had I to fear? And then, again, was I not all the time hearing hymns sung for my comfort and prayers offered for my restoration, and that if recovery could not be granted me, it was as earnestly asked that I might pass away without suffering and have a happy admission into heaven? Why should I be very much disturbed? And even if disquieting thoughts did cross my mind, for I could not help questions arising as to whether I had done my duty to a perishing world with my time and influence, and money, and family, it was all in a dreamy way. So it seemed as though it were impossible to do anything different under the circumstances than let things drift. How could I do otherwise, with the burning fever lapping up the vital current, and my brain all confused and my energies laid prostrate? Consequently, when I complained that I had not much joy, I readily acceded to a suggestion made by my minister that my condition prevented it. Then I felt, moreover, that if I were not ready for the change, I had neither the thought nor the energy required to begin so serious a business over again as the salvation of my soul. Besides, how could I make the confession in the presence of my wife and children and church comrades that I had been mistaken all these years, and that my life had been a failure? No, it was too late, and I was too ill for any such action. One thing I could do, and that I did, I cast myself, with what force of soul I had left, on the mercy of my Savior, and again repeated a couplet, which had always been a favorite with me. I am a poor sinner, and nothing at all, but Jesus Christ is my all in all. It was with this very sentence on my lips, a sentence taken up and reproduced at the memorial service held on the following Sabbath, that a cold numbness came creeping over me, and a great difficulty in breathing followed. My friends were alarmed. I read their apprehension in their faces. Some fell on their knees and broke out in prayer, while others wept, and my dear ones moistened my lips and kissed my brow, and spoke their last and lingering farewells in my ears. Meanwhile, a strange faintness seized me, destroying my consciousness. My next sensation was altogether beyond description. I was in heaven. After the first feeling of surprise occasioned by this sudden translation had somewhat subsided, I looked around me and took in the situation. It was delightful beyond anything of earth, and yet some of the more beautiful sounds and feelings and scenes of the world I had just left appeared to be reproduced in my new experience after an enchanting fashion. Still, I am constrained to say no human eye ever beheld such beauty, no earthly ear ever heard such music, no human heart ever experienced such ecstasy as it was my privilege to see and hear and feel during the first hours I spent in the celestial country. Above me was the loveliest of blue skies. Around me was an atmosphere so balmy that it made my whole physical frame vibrate with pleasure. By the bank of roses, on which I found myself reposing, there flowed the clearest and purest of rivers, which seemed to dance with delight to the murmurings of its own waters. The trees that grew on its banks were covered with the greenest foliage, and laden with most delicious fruit, sweet to my taste beyond all earthly sweetness. By lifting my hand, I could pluck and eat the fruit to my heart's delight. In every direction, above and around, the air was not only laden with the richest of odors yielded by the loveliest of flowers, but rendered vocal with sweetest sounds, and filled with fairest forms. Floating about me were beautiful beings, who I felt by instinct were angels and archangels, seraph and seraphim, cherub and cherubim, together with the blood-washed and perfected saints who had come from the world below, sometimes far away and sometimes drawing nearer. The blue sky appeared at times to be full of white-winged, happy, worshipping, joyous beings, while the whole country, apparently of limitless extent, seemed to be filled with a blissful ecstasy that could only be realized by being experienced. My sensations may, perhaps, be imagined. At first I was swallowed up with a sort of rapturous intoxication, which was immensely enhanced by the blessed consciousness that I was securely landed in heaven, that I was safe, and should suffer no more. Far from a world of grief and sin, with God eternally shut in. And then, strange to say, a new set of feelings began to creep over me. Marvelous as it may appear, I felt somewhat solitary and not a little sad, even in the midst of this infinitude of felicity, for, up to this moment, I was alone. Not one of the happy beings who were soaring and singing in the bright ether above me, or who were hastening hither and thither, each intent upon the performance of some high mission, had as yet approached or spoken to me. I was alone in heaven. And then, in a still further and yet more mysterious way, I felt in myself a sort of unfitness for the society of these pure beings who were sailing around me in such indescribable loveliness. And yet, how could this be? Had I come there uninvited, or by mistake? Was I not counted worthy of being a partaker of this glorious inheritance? I was bewildered. It was indeed a mystery. My thoughts went back to earth, and, as though by an angel's hand, the history of my past life was unrolled before my eyes. What a record it was! At the first glance, I seemed to be able to take in the substance and meaning of my entire earthly career, becoming at the same time strangely conscious of a marvelous quickening of my intellectual powers, realizing that I could, in a moment, take in what would have required a day to understand with. My poor, darkened faculties went on the earth. With my quickened mind, I saw, to my delight, at that very first glance, that this register of my earthly existence, this supernatural biography, contained no record of any of my misdeeds before my conversion. Indeed, that part of my life appeared to be very much a blank. Neither was there any mention, to my utmost satisfaction, of the sins I'd committed since that time. It was as though some friendly hand had gone through the roll and with kindly labor blotted out the record of all the evil doings of my human life. Now this was very gratifying. I felt like shouting hallelujah. Over and over again, in fact, I made some attempt to do so, and well, I might, for was I not delivered through the mercy of Jesus Christ from the pain of having these things eternally staring me in the face, in this beautiful holy land, among all these holy beings where, it seemed to me, that the very memory of sin would defile? Nevertheless, a second glance at my roll appalled me, for while the evil things I had done were omitted, it revealed the kind of life required from me by the light I had enjoyed and the opportunities with which I had been favored. Nay, the revelation went much deeper, for it described in detail the objects which had influenced me during my earthly career. It set forth the purpose for which my thoughts and feelings and activities had been mainly spent, and brought forth the ends for which I had employed my time, my money, my influence, and all the other talents and gifts with which God had entrusted me to use for His glory and the salvation of men. Every chapter of this roll carried back my thoughts to the condition of the world I had left, and while I mused on it, there came up before my eyes such a graphic picture of its hatred of God, its rejection of Christ, its terrible wickedness, with all the wretchedness, destitution, and abominations flowing out of this state of things as appalled me. As this part of my vision passed before my wondering eyes, there came into my ears such a hurricane of cursing and blasphemy, and such wild wails of anguish and woe as almost stunned me. It was a terrible recollection. I had seen these sights and heard these sounds when on the earth. Not too often, it is true, for I had hid myself from them. But oh, they blinded and stupefied me now, for they appeared to indicate a condition a million times blacker and viler, more wretched and piteous than they had seemed when on the earth. I felt like putting my hands before my eyes and my fingers in my ears to shut this hideous apparition out from sight and hearing. So intensely real and present did they seem. They wrung my soul with sorrow and self-reproach, for alongside these horrid recollections, the roll of memory, at which I had just glanced, showed me how I had occupied myself during the few years which I had been allowed to live amidst all these miseries. After Jesus Christ had called me to be a soldier and to fight for Him, I was reminded how, instead of fighting His battles, saving souls by bringing them to His feet, and so preparing them for admission to this lovely place, I had been intent on earthly things, selfishly seeking my own carnal interests, worrying about my own personal cares and anxieties, and spending my life in practical unbelief, disloyalty, and disobedience to all my most sacred obligations. I must say again, I felt horror-stricken. If only at that moment I could have crept out of that land of pure delight, about which I had sung so much in the past, and gone back to the world of darkness, sin, and misery which I had just left, that I might spend another lifetime fighting for my Lord, combating these evils, and striving to save the sufferers by poverty and cross-bearing. How gladly I should have done so. But that could not be. I was a fixture. I was in heaven. Heaven must be my abode forever, and, contradictory as it may seem, this thought filled my soul with unutterable regret. And then came another thought, wilder than all that had gone before it. You must not forget that it is a vision I am relating. The thought was this: would it be possible for me to obtain a commission, or rather a permission, to go back to the world, to that very part of it from which I had come, clothed in some human form, and live my life over again? Live it in a manner worthy of my profession, my Christ, and my opportunity. Could this be? At that moment, if an answer in the affirmative had been brought me, I would have willingly forfeited my heavenly blessedness. I would gladly have undergone ages of hardship, ignominy, poverty, and pain. I would have given 1,000,000 of money, nay, a world had it been mine to give. But I could see no hope of such a second probation. What was to be done? I had not been musing thus many seconds, for thoughts appeared to flow with remarkable rapidity. As I have said, in this new world, when quick as a lightning flash, one of these bright inhabitants whom I had watched floating far off in the clouds of glory descended and stood before my astonished gaze. I can never forget the feelings with which this apparition inspired me. Describe the shape and features and bearing of this noble form, I cannot, and I will not attempt to do so. He was at the same time human, and yet angelic, earthly, and yet celestial. I discerned at a glance that he was one of the blood-washed multitude who had come out of the great tribulations of earth. I not only judged this from his majestic appearance, but from an inward instinct that the being before me was a man, a redeemed and glorified man. He looked at me, and I could not help but return his gaze. In fact, his eyes compelled me, and in doing so, I confessed to being ravished with his beauty. I could never have believed the human face divine could have been made to bear so grand a stamp of dignity and charm. But far beyond the entrancing loveliness of those celestial features was the expression that beamed through every lineament of that countenance, and shone through the eyes that were gazing upon me. Those eyes appeared to me, moreover, as sunlit windows through which I could see right into the depths of the pure and benevolent soul within. I do not know how I appeared to my beautiful visitor. I knew not what form I bore, for I had not as yet beheld myself mirrored since I had exchanged mortality for immortality. Nevertheless, I evidently had a deep interest for him, an interest that seemed of a saddening nature, for his features appeared to grow almost sorrowful as I stood there with my eyes fixed on him by a fascinating spell. He spoke first. Had he not done so, I could never have summoned courage to address him. His voice was soft and musical. I understood him almost before I heard his words, although I cannot now tell what language he used. I suppose it was the universal language of heaven. He informed me that my advent was known throughout a certain district of the celestial region, where were gathered the ransomed spirits who had come from the very neighborhood in which I had formerly resided. The tidings of my arrival had been flashed through the heavenly telephone of that particular district. My name had been whispered on every hillside, and echoed in every valley, had been breathed from every tree and flower, had been sounded forth at every turn of the golden street, had been articulated in every room of every mansion, and proclaimed from every tower and pinnacle of the stupendous temple in which these glorified saints, day and night, present their worship to the great Father. All who had known me on earth, all who had any knowledge of my family, my opportunities for helping on the kingdom of Christ, whom they worshipped and adored, were burning to see me, and to hear me tell of the victories I had won, and the souls I had blessed when on earth, and all were specially anxious to hear if I had been the means of bringing salvation to the loved ones they had left behind. As all this was poured into my soul by my visitor, I knew not which way to look. Again and again, I remembered my life of ease and comfort. What could I say? How could I appear with the record of my life before these waiting spirits? What was there in it better than a long-drawn story of self-gratification? I had no martyr experiences to recount. I had sacrificed nothing for his dear sake worth naming on earth. much less worthy of being published in heaven. My mind was running in this direction when I think my visitor must have discerned what I was thinking about, and felt some pity for me, seeing that he spoke again. Where you find yourself, he said, is not actually heaven, but only one of its forecourts. Presently the Lord himself, with a procession of his chosen ones, will come to take you into the city itself, where you will reside, if he deems you worthy, that is, if your service on the battlefield below has pleased him. Meanwhile, I have obtained permission to come and speak to you concerning a soul, who, I understand, lives near your late residence, and in whom I feel a deep interest. Our knowledge of the transactions of earth is, for our own sakes, very limited, but now and then we are permitted to get a glimpse of what is passing there. Can you, he said, looking at me with an unspeakable longing, tell me anything of my son? He was my only son. I loved him, dearly loved him too much. I spoiled him when a child. He had his own way. He grew up willful, passionate, and disobedient. My example helped him not, and here a cloud for a moment settled upon that beautiful brow, but vanished as quickly as it came. Memory has been busy of late with that melancholy chapter of my life, he said, as though talking to himself, and then he returned to the story of his prodigal son. I myself, through the instrumentality of the Salvation Army, was rescued from a life of sin and shame, washed, regenerated, taught to fight for souls, and had the high privilege of winning many to the blood-stained banner of the cross. An accident, however, suddenly overtook me while at my employment, and has suddenly swung me into heaven, and now, he added, where is my boy? Oh, give me some tidings of my boy. He lived near you, I believe. He had business dealings with you. Is he saved? What did you do for him? Is there any hope? Tell me what his feelings to my Lord were when you last spoke to him. He ceased speaking. My heart sunk within me. What could I say? I knew the boy. The story of the father's death and his prodigal son had been told me, and yet I had never addressed one serious word to the young man about his soul or about his Savior. I had been busy with other things. And now what could I say to his father as he stood there before me? I was dumb. The cloud I had noticed before gathered again on the face of my visitor, only with a darker shadow this time. He must have guessed it all. He looked at me with a glance which expressed the disappointment to himself and the pity for me which he evidently felt. Then he turned from me and, suddenly spreading forth his white wings, he soared away out of my sight. I was so intently gazing on the receding form of my visitor that I failed to notice a second glorified being had occupied his place. I turned and looked upon the newcomer. It was a spirit of the same order, belonging to the ransomed multitude who were once dwellers on the earth. There was the same dignity of bearing, the same marvelous expression of inward power and purity and joy, but in this case these graces were combined with a beauty of a more delicate and enthralling mold. Divinely fair, as I thought my first visitor, more beautiful than any conception or dream of earth could be, yet here was a beauty that surpassed it. My former visitor, I have said, bore the form of a glorified man. This was evidently the form of a glorified woman. I had, when on earth, sometimes wished that I could have looked upon Eve in the hour when, young and pure and beautiful, she came forth from the hands of her Maker, and had imagined something of what her lovely figure must have been on that bridal morning, bearing as she did the fair image of her Creator, and being, perhaps, the most marvelous work of God. Now here I saw Eve reproduced before my eyes, clothed in immortal youth, as pure, as beautiful, nay, more so than her first mother could possibly have been, for was not this the divine Master's finished workmanship? But I was soon awakened from my reverie by the voice of the fair creature, who, from her manner, evidently wished to speak to me on some matter of great importance. She introduced herself somewhat after the fashion of my previous interrogator. She, too, had come from the very same neighborhood where I had lived so long. She told me her name. I had heard it before. She was a widow who had struggled with great difficulties. Her husband's death had been her life. Converted at his grave, she had given herself up unreservedly to fight for the Lord. Her children had been her first care. They had all been converted and entered the battlefield, except one. That unsaved one was a girl who had been her mother's delight. She had grown up lovely in form, the village pride, but, alas, had gone astray. It was the old story of wrong and seduction and cruel abandonment, with all the consequent train of miseries. The mention of that name brought a similar saddening cloud over her lovely face to that which had dimmed the bright visage of my first visitor. But, as in his case, the cloud vanished almost as soon as it appeared. I listened to the story as it came from this mother's heart. I had heard something of the painful incident when on earth, but I had turned my ear away from it as being no concern of mine. Little did I ever think I was going to be confronted with it in heaven. And now the bright spirit turned on me those beautiful eyes, gleaming with love and pity, and spoke again. My daughter lived near you. You know her. What have you done for her? Have you saved my child? At this, I must have cried out in agony. I know I put my hands before my eyes, for I could no longer bear to meet her glance. How long she continued to look on me with her powerful, piercing, pitying eyes, I know not, but when I withdrew my hand she was gone, and the silvery sheen of her dazzling wings marked her out to my searching gaze like a speck on the distant blue. Again I gasped out, "Oh, my God! Is this heaven? Will these interrogations go on forever? Will the meanness and selfishness of my past life, with all their sad consequences from which I had hoped forever to have got away in this country, haunt me every day and every hour throughout the coming eternity? What shall I do? Can I not go back to earth and do something to redeem myself from this wretched sense of unworthiness? Would it be possible for me to live my life over again?" This question had hardly passed through my mind when there came another rush of wings, and down beside me alighted another form, resembling the first that had spoken to me, and yet, oh, so different. But I will not stay to describe him. You must imagine him. His introduction was much the same, but his story was different. He had been a great sinner, but had been awakened and won to Christ by the Salvation Army a short time back, and had joined its rank. Much forgiven, he had loved much. All his desire when on earth was to get free from the entanglements of business, and devote himself, as a Salvation Army officer, to the work of saving men. When just about to realize his wish, he had been sent for to heaven, and here he was, a spirit of glory and joy, coming to inquire from me concerning the corps in which he had been a soldier, and of the crowd of unconverted companions he had left behind. Did I know his old corps? He asked. Their hall was close by my house of business. Had I helped them in their struggle with difficulties? Had I done anything for his old mates who were drinking and cursing and fighting their way to hell? He had died with prayers for them on his lips. Had I done anything to stop them on their way to ruin? To all this searching appeal, what could I say? I knew his corps, but I had never given them a word of encouragement. I knew the hovels in which his old mates lived, and the drinking saloons in which they spent their money, but I had been too busy, or too proud, or too shamefaced to seek them out with the tidings of a Savior's love. Again, I was speechless. He guessed my feelings, I suppose, compassionated me, and left in sadness, at least in as much sadness as is possible in that happy land. For myself, I was in anguish, strange as it may appear, considering I was in heaven. But so it was, and wondering whether there was not some comfort for me, and involuntarily looking around me, I saw, or thought I saw, a marvelous phenomenon on the distant horizon. All that part of the heavens appeared to be filled with a brilliant light, surpassing the blaze of 1,000 suns at noonday, and yet there was no oppressive glare rendering it difficult to the gaze, as is the case with our own sun when he shines in his midday glory. Here was a brilliance far surpassing anything that can be imagined, and yet but for my recent experiences I should have looked upon it with indescribable delight. As I gazed and wondered what it could mean, it appeared to move a little closer, and I perceived clearly that it was coming in the direction of the spot on which I stood, for I had not left the banks of the beautiful river where I first found myself, and now I could distinctly hear the sound of music. The distance was a great many miles according to the measure of earth, but the atmosphere was so clear, and I found my eyesight so strong that I could readily discern with the naked eye objects which on earth would have required a powerful telescope to see. The sound came nearer. It was music beyond question, and such music as I had never heard before. But there was a strange commingling of other sounds, which altogether made an entrancing melody composed, as I afterwards discovered, of the strains that came forth from a multitude of musicians mingled with the shouts and songs that proceeded from innumerable voices. Gradually, the rapturous hosts drew nearer rapidly. I might have said, but that my curiosity was so strongly aroused to know what it signified that a few minutes seemed an age. At length, I was able to comprehend the marvelous sight that approached me. But who could describe it? The whole firmament was filled, as it were, with innumerable forms of beauty and dignity, far surpassing those with whom I had already made an acquaintance. Here, evidently, was a representative portion of the aristocracy of heaven accompanying its king, who, as my first visitor had informed me, was coming to welcome into the heaven of heavens those who had fought a good fight, who had kept the faith, and who had overcome in the conflict, as he had. Overcome. I stood transfixed with awe and wonder. Could it be possible? Was I at last actually going to see my Lord and be welcomed by him? In the thought of this rapture, I forgot the sorrow which, only a moment before, had reigned in my heart, and my whole nature swelled with expectation and delight. And now the procession was upon me. I had seen some of the pageants of earth displays that required the power of mighty monarchs and the stored wealth of prosperous nations to create, but those, when contrasted with the scene that now spread itself before my wondering eyes, were each or all combined as the gleam of a feeble rush, light to the blaze of a tropical sun. I have to say of this, as I have already said of other scenes that have passed before me, I cannot attempt a description. It would be impossible. Moreover, spectacle was to my eyes simply one vast sea of glory, and to my ears an overwhelming rush of harmony. But on the procession came, and as it neared me, I fell prostrate before it. What wonderful beings these heavenly spirits appeared, each one looking in himself, to my poor untutored eyes, like a god, so far as greatness and power could be expressed by the outward appearance of any creature. Rank after rank passed me by, each spirit turning his eye upon me, or seeming to do so, and to everyone I could not help feeling that I was somewhat an object of pity. Perhaps it was my own feelings that made me imagine this, but it certainly appeared to me as though these noble beings regarded me as a craven, cowardly soul who had only cared for my own interests on earth, and had only been induced to come up there from similar selfish motives. However, onward the mighty cavalcade swept. I have said cavalcade, for while part of the procession filled the heavens with their shining wings, and another part walked with upright mien, the picture of dignity itself, there was a host, as imposing as any, or more so, mounted upon the most beautiful white horses, more beautiful than ever were beheld by any human eye. On they came. Thousands passed me, yet there appeared no diminution of the numbers yet to come. I looked at the train as it stretched backwards, but my eye could see no end to it. There must have been millions upon millions of spirits. It was indeed a multitude that no man could number. All this mighty host were praising God, either in hymns expressive of adoration and worship, or by recounting, in songs of rapture, the triumphant victories gained on earth in the name of Calvary's Prince, or in describing some of the wonderful works of Jehovah in other parts of the vast empire. And now the great central glory and attraction of this stupendous procession was at hand. I gathered this from the still more dignified character of the beings who came marching past, by the heavier crash of the music, and the louder shouts of exultation which came pealing forth from all around. I was right, and before I could prepare my spirit for the rapturous vision of the king was here. The procession halted, and at the word of command in an instant formed up in three sides of a square in front of me, the king standing in the center immediately opposite to the spot where I'd prostrated myself. In the midst of these circling hosts, rising, tier above tier, high into the blue vault above, each gazing upon him with eyes lustrous with the love they bore him, I beheld the celestial form of the God-man who once died for me upon the cross. What a sight that was! Surely, it was worth toiling a lifetime to behold. Nearest to the king were the patriarchs and apostles of ancient times. Next to these worthies, rank after rank, came the holy martyrs who had died for him. Then followed the army of warriors who had fought for him in every part of the world, while around and about, above and below, were myriads and myriads of spirits, redeemed from the earth, who, although never heard of outside their own neighborhood, or beyond their own time, had, with self-denying zeal, and untiring toil labored to extend God's kingdom and to save the souls of men. Then, circling the gorgeous scene, was an innumerable host of angelic beings who had kept their first estate, proud, it seemed to me, to minister to the happiness and exaltation of the soldier saints who had faithfully lived and died for their Lord in the poor world from whence I came. I was bewildered by the spectacle. The songs, the music, the shouts of the multitude, like the roar of 1,000 cataracts, echoed and re-echoed through the sunlit mountains, and the magnificent and endless array of happy spirits ravished my senses with unspeakable delight. All at once, however, I recollected myself, and bethought me of the high presence before whom I was bowed, and lifting up my eyes, I beheld him gazing upon me. What a look that was! It was not pain, and yet it was not pleasure. It was not anger, and yet it was not approval. Anyway, I felt that in that countenance, so transcendently admirable and glorious, there was yet no welcome for me. I had read this in the faces of my previous visitors. I read it again in the face of my Lord. That face, that divine face, seemed to say to me, for language was not needed to indicate what his feelings towards me were. He was saying, "You will find yourself little in harmony with those who were once the companions of my tribulation, and are now partakers of my glory, who counted not their lives dear unto them in order that they might bring honor to me and salvation to men." And as he spoke, he waved his hand and gave a look of loving admiration at the host of apostles, martyrs, and warriors gathered around him. Oh, that look of Jesus! I felt that it would be worth dying 100 deaths at the stake, or being torn asunder by wild beasts to gain one such loving recognition. The angelic escort felt it too, for their responsive burst of praise and song shook the very ground on which I lay in the vaulted skies above my head. Then the king turned his eyes on me again. How I wished that some mountain would fall upon me and hide me forever from his presence. But I wished in vain. Some invisible and irresistible force compelled me to look up, and his eyes met mine once more. I felt, rather than heard him say to me, in words that engraved themselves in living fire upon my excited brain, "Go back to earth. You shall have another opportunity, and if you prove yourself worthy of my name, and show to the world that you possess my spirit, by doing my work, and by making yourself a savior of men, you shall return hither, and I will give you a place in my conquering train and a share in my everlasting glory." They were mingled feelings. First came the unutterable anguish arising out of a full realization of a wasted life, a life squandered on the paltry ambitions and trifling pleasures of earth, which might have been filled with deeds that would have produced a never-ending harvest of celestial fruit, won for me the approval of heaven's King, and made me worthy to be the companion of these glorified heroes. But, combined with this self-reproach, there was also a gleam of hope. My soul's desire to return to earth was to be gratified. Perhaps it was in response to the longings which I had felt ever since the consciousness of my earthly failures had dawned upon me that this favor was to be granted me. I should have the privilege of living my life over again. True, it was a huge responsibility, but my Lord would be with me, and his Spirit would qualify me for my task. I embraced the opportunity with all my heart. And then I closed my eyes and gave myself over, body, soul, and spirit, to live and fight and die, not for my own salvation, but for the glory of Christ and the salvation of men. The king spoke again, this time pledging his word that his presence should go with me back to earth and make me more than conqueror through his blood. And with the joy of this assurance, I awoke. The crowd of shining ones had vanished. The music was silent, and behold, it was all a dream.